afternoon, everyone. Just a couple housekeeping tips before we get started. As I mentioned, all attendee lines are muted. I mentioned there is a Q&A box on the bottom right of your screen. We'll answer as many questions during this live broadcast as time allows. Afterwards, we will send you, marketing will email you I can't talk, sorry, not a good start to this webinar. Marketing will email you the program slides. If you don't get them in the next couple days, usually they come out the next day. But if you don't receive them in the next couple days or the next business day, also make sure to check your spam folders. If there's a good quality recording, if we're able to, we will share that with you as well, so that because I'm sure you're going to be so fascinated by this, you're going to want to share it with everyone you know. And let's see here. I also want to mention our website for more up-to-date topics. Subscribe to our blog, all that good stuff, which is listed there. And so today, I was talking to my partner, Matt Horn. I'm Rebecca Dobbs-Bush, and Matt's going to be doing a lot of this talking, the majority of it. We are partners at Smith-Amundsen together. I work in the labor and employment practice group. Matt works in construction, corporate, and OSHA, safety, all of that good stuff. And Matt, I know we've been talking a lot more these days because a lot of businesses are reopening and employees aren't happy with what's happening, or people in town disagree, and everybody's calling up OSHA. So Matt and I have had a lot of reasons to talk lately these days, even though we're isolating in our homes. And I'll let Matt introduce himself a little bit later. I just have a couple slides to talk about, so I'm going to mention them now. First off, I've been a partner at Smith-Amundsen, or I've been practicing for over a decade now, and doing exclusively labor and employment. Okay, so, and Matt has been, in the business the same, if not longer. We might have even been at Smith-Amundsen for most of our careers together. I don't know about that. But I think we might have been. So wanted to just mention that there is extreme, level of experience here in terms of dealing with OSHA and employment laws and all of these kind of things. So that is helpful. Why? Because some of this, well, all of this, frankly, is new. And a lot of it is leaving room for interpretation. And I think it's helpful to work with someone who has experience dealing with the agencies at play, because we know the history of how they operate, which is one of the reasons why when I have an OSHA issue come up, I know general safety doing labor and employment, but I call up Matt because he has the most experience at dealing with OSHA specifically, and that's incredibly helpful. So we're going to try to share some of that guidance with you today. But first thing I want to make clear, because there's a lot of confusion on this right now, and especially with me sitting up here in Manitowoc by all of you in Wisconsin, Matt talking to you out of Illinois, which is a little bit different. We know it's a world of difference in Illinois versus Wisconsin, even though we're right next door. The Supreme Court case that came out, and I know the chamber made, gave you some guidance on that last week, and I just wanted to be clear at the outset that this does not have any impact on the need to social distance. And so today, Matt's going to talk about what you're stuck with is, maybe we don't have either safer at home order to deal with, but you still have Wisconsin Department of Health Services to deal with. You still have the federal guidelines set by CDC and OSHA in terms of protecting your employees and keeping them safe. And speaking of keeping your employees safe, leads me to the next step. This is a slide, or a PDF, I suppose, that's available directly through the Department of Labor. And I really like it because the FFCRA, the Families First, has been out. It was effective April 1. For those of you who, were shut down during that period, maybe you're not aware of it, it doesn't apply to you if you're over 500 employees. And there's a series of convoluted exceptions, and, it's job security for Matt and I. So, I guess I can't complain, but it makes it hard for our clients to follow. And I really like this PDF. The Department of Labor does some really great FAQs and user-friendly, understandable handouts that there's really no point in redoing. And I think this is a nice summary to remind you that just because your business might be allowed to reopen right now, if you follow guidelines, you have employees at different stages in their situations, and depending on those situations, they might not be required to come back immediately. So if you need more information about that, it's at dol.gov/FFCRA, and we also have a ton of information on our website, which we'll link to at the end again. So now I am going to get you started with the fun stuff, because you're all thinking about reopening. I know we're all itching because it's springtime, and Matt's going to be our Debbie Downer and tell us all of the rules we have to be careful of so that we don't get sued. Okay, Matt.
Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, I should say. As Rebecca indicated, my practice is entirely focused essentially on OSHA at this point. And while I'm located in Illinois, in northern part of Illinois, and I spend a fair amount of time in Wisconsin, my practice is national. So I'm advising my clients on these issues across the country. And the good thing about that is the OSHA and the CDC guidance is the same across the country. So in Illinois, we do have a shelter-in-place order. You guys just had yours lifted. But the OSHA and the CDC guidance is the same across the country. I am intimately familiar with OSHA. I have been dealing with OSHA for 15 years. It's the vast majority of my practice. But the last few months is the first time that I've really been involved with anything related to the CDC. And how that ties in is OSHA is essentially relying in many respects on the CDC guidance. So OSHA is the enforcement body of their standards, and the CDC is more of the educating body. It's an interesting relationship because, you know, OSHA doesn't have any standards relating to COVID, right? And if you follow the news closely, especially relating to OSHA, which I do, people, the public, the legislatures have been very critical of OSHA for not adopting standards relating to COVID, right? Because without standards, what's funny is OSHA really doesn't have authority to enforce any of this other than under its general duty clause. So OSHA has all these standards that apply to all these industries, and then they have this kind of catch-all general duty clause. And that's what OSHA has been relying on to try and get employers to comply with CDC guidance. So it's an interesting dynamic. Next slide, Rebecca. So why are you guys here today, right? You want to know, what do I need to do to open back up? And I was looking through the attendee list, and I usually give this presentation to a construction group or a manufacturing group or a healthcare group. And this group is very diverse. I saw colleges, I saw cities, I saw healthcare, manufacturing, construction. So the CDC and OSHA guidance being put out varies greatly for the people on this call. So I wish that I could give you specific guidance to your industry, but due to the attendee list here, that's not possible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over the general rules and the general guidance that the CDC and OSHA has put out, right? But again, you want to know, what do I need to do? You need to do these three things. You need to comply with all local, state, and federal orders. Now, I know that your guys' state order was found unconstitutional by the state Supreme Court, but then I heard that counties and cities and were racing to enact their own orders. So if you're in one of the counties or one of the cities that has their own orders, you need to follow it, right? That's the first step. The second step is you need to identify and implement the applicable CDC and OSHA guidance and standards, right? So look at your local order, look at your county order, look at your municipality order, and then look at the CDC and OSHA guidance. And you have to take that information and you have to wade through it, and you have to essentially compile a COVID plan that you need to adapt. And so these are the three things that we are recommending to all employers at this time: is wade through the guidance, figure out what applies to you, document it, and follow it. Next slide, Rebecca. All right. Now, a lot of people say, what if I don't do that, right? And we've got, you know, this issue is so divisive, where you have some people who are so serious about it, who won't leave their house, and you have other people that don't care about it at all. It's become a real political football. So you've got some employers just opening up and saying, this is against my constitutional rights. I'm going to run my business. I'm going to run it how I see fit. And you're not going to tell me not to. All right. Well, what happens? What happens if you don't follow the local guidance? What happens if you don't follow the CDC or the OSHA guidance? Well, your employees could get sick, right? Your customers can get sick. You can get negative publicity. This has been a huge one. I have clients who have been killed in the press. Usually it's their employees reaching out to the press or reaching out to a union or a trade organization who then is reaching out to the press. And then what happens beyond that? Well, then we start talking about lawsuits, claims by employees, right? You didn't protect them, claims by customers, you didn't protect them, and then claims by anyone who contracts COVID from employees or customers. And this is where COVID gets so tricky is, you know, obviously you have personal injury attorneys that are going to make something out of this, right? Nobody's just going to say, hey, you know, let's just let all this go. There are people that are going to be out there that are going to try and profit off of this. And, you know, what happens to the employee who contracts COVID in your workplace and goes home and gets their mother or father or their child sick and one of them dies, right? Where does it end? And the answer at this point is we don't know. We don't know what the claims are going to look like. We don't know where the liability is going to start and stop. And so the best thing that you can do, understanding that, is follow all of the guidance being issued, because there are going to be essentially two ways to defend COVID-related claims, which I think once this all settles down, there's going to be a flurry of COVID-related claims. So what's the best thing you can do? Best thing you can do is follow all the guidance out there, right? Say, I did my duty, I complied with my obligations, therefore I wasn't negligent. So even if somebody got sick, it's unfortunate. You know, the other way you're going to fight these claims is you need to figure out how this person really got sick. And I just don't know how people are going to be able to track that. But I do know that COVID claims are coming. They're going to come in a tsunami, and we need to be prepared for them. Next slide. All right, so CDC guidelines. Again, the relationship that we have between OSHA and the CDC here is one of them kind of working together, right? CDC really putting out the guidance, OSHA being the one trying to enforce that guidance by way of its general duty clause. And, you know, again, I don't even know if I had seen the CDC website until March. And now I have to go on it every day. And I have to go on it every day because the guidance changes every day, because what we learn about COVID changes every day. So they've put employers in a difficult position because you guys need to stay abreast of what's happening and the modification to the guidance, which is changing. Notably, I gave this presentation in late April, and, you know, I was preparing my slides for the presentation today, and I basically had to change everything because that's how quickly everything's changed. In the last 3 weeks, the slides that I had prepared were essentially outdated. So per CDC, all employers need to consider how best to decrease the spread of COVID in their workplace, right? So, you know, there's people on the call who operate schools, people who are part of a municipality, people from a bank, people from a restaurant, people from a construction, from a manufacturing company. All of you guys have different guidance to follow. Now, what does the CDC say that they want you to do? They want you to reduce transmission among employees, maintain healthy business operations, and maintain a healthy work environment. These are kind of the three things that are listed in the CDC guidance to businesses. Now, the description of those three things, to me, I can't really understand, why the descriptions are so different. They seem very similar to me. And part of that's, creating the headache and the issues is you have CDC putting out all of this guidance, but it's not particularly well organized. It's not particularly well explained. So, even as an attorney that wades through regulations and statutes constantly, I mean, going through the CDC guidance can be difficult. Let's go to the next slide. The good thing is CDC has realized that the pages and pages and pages on their website of text, I mean hundreds and hundreds of lines of text, has been very difficult for people to wade through, especially small employers. So they've put out these PDF decision trees, and they've created a decision tree for every industry, right? So again, depending on your industry, find your decision tree. This is the general CDC decision tree, and frankly, all of the industry-specific ones look somewhat like this, right? And so you, as being in Wisconsin, not having a statewide shelter-in-place order, if you don't have a county or a municipality order, then this is what you're looking at for determining whether you can open up. And they all start the same way. Should you consider opening, right? Will reopening be consistent with applicable state and local orders? Are you ready to protect employees at higher risk for severe illness, right? And so they're signaling here that, listen, if the state says you can't open, you can't open. And if you're not willing to protect your employees, especially those at high risk, you can't open, right? But let's assume that the answer to both of those questions is yes. Then you go to the next step. Right? And this is really what the CDC wants you to do. They want you to promote healthy hygiene practices such as hand washing, face coverings if necessary, clean, disinfect, ventilate, sanitize, encourage social distancing and enhance spacing between employees, customers, et cetera, use physical barriers, change the flow, allow teleworking, consider modifying travel and commuting practices. And then this is the one that a lot of people miss. You need to train your employees on it, right? So you need to tell your employees the steps that you're going to do to protect them. And I think this is where a lot of employers fall short, and this is where they get themselves into trouble because, I have 5 COVID-related OSHA fatality inspections going on right now across the country. And I just started getting these about 10 days ago. And now they're going like gangbusters because OSHA is not just conducting inspections of fatalities that are directly caused by COVID, they're conducting inspections of anyone who dies with COVID, which we've heard about. But, where many of my clients have fallen short is they have done all of these things. They have implemented all of these practices, but they haven't told their employees about it, right? Their employees have seen it. Their employees have seen the barriers coming in. They've seen the face masks, but they haven't told them about it and they haven't trained them on it. And I think that's a step that a lot of people miss is you need to adopt all this stuff, but you need to tell your employees about it. You need to train them on it. You need to make them aware of it. And I think that's the easiest way to avoid employees being upset, angry, disgruntled, etc. Okay, so if we get through those things, then, we go to the next step, okay? And the next step is...
I want to say one thing.
Go ahead.
Hold on, Matt. I want to say one thing about training employees. Something that I've had in dealing with managing employees and safety violations is that I know this is confusing. I know this is crazy. I know also, though, that people don't like to discipline employees. Managers don't like to deal with that. So the problem that I'm starting to see is that you do this, you train your employees, you tell them about what you have to do, you even do the written guidelines, and then I see people who, the employees just don't do it, or they just don't use their face mask, or they walk around and do whatever. And I get that's going to happen, but then it's on you to follow up and discipline and enforce. And if you don't, it's really hard to say this was a credible policy that we maintained. I've also had situations where, well, we'll let you do this all day and then we'll, write you up 3 days later. You can't do that with safety violations. If it's a real safety issue, the law does not like in the employment arena. They don't give you a lot of credibility for your termination or your discipline reason. If it's such a safety, but you stood there and watched the employee risk their lives and everyone else's for 3 days before you gave the write-up. So that's all I wanted to mention, Matt. Go on.
Yeah, and Rebecca raises a good point. It's not sufficient to have everything look good on paper and then not do any of it in practice. In fact, that's probably the worst case scenario. And we all see the employees, we all know about the employees that refuse to follow rules and refuse to follow guidance. And, the sad reality is those are the first ones to file claims, right? You think if they get sick or if they go home and get someone sick that they're not going to sue you or they're not going to bring a claim against you? Typically, they're the first ones to do it. But back on the CDC decision tree. So you've got all of you can reopen. You're going to take care of everyone that's at high risk. You're going to do all of these health and safety things you need to do. Then you need to do ongoing monitoring, right? So you need to ask your employees if they have any symptoms. If they are, you can't let them come. You need to encourage them that if they're sick to stay home. Same thing if you have a customer, if you're allowing customers into your business, you need to monitor them. If something seems wrong, you need to ask them to leave. They need to follow the same rules that you're setting out for them. And then, if someone is exposed, there's quarantine obligations. So it's not just, hey, I've got these things in place. I've got people wearing face masks. I've got these plexiglass separators up. I'm good to go. No, it's continuing to monitor people and to make sure that sick people aren't coming in and infecting others. Next slide. And so then we looked at the CDC decision tree, and now this is the general OSHA guidance. And OSHA has actually put out a pretty nice short PDF for each industry. So again, you should go to the OSHA website and the CDC website and look for their guidance specific to your industry. If you find it difficult to wade through the hundreds and hundreds of lines of text that they have, if you poke around enough, you can find the PDFs that they have summarizing this. And so, OSHA put this particular guidance out, I think it was in late March, and they've still kind of held true to it. And this stuff's pretty self-explanatory, right? Employees should wash their hands. They shouldn't touch their eyes, nose, or mouth. They should avoid close contact with people who are sick. They should assess the hazards to which workers may be exposed, evaluate the risk, and then implement the necessary controls, including physical barriers, social distancing, PPE, face mask, cleaning supplies, etc. Next slide. And so OSHA has actually created a risk exposure assessment, right? And that's what they want you to do. I mean, even outside of COVID, what OSHA always wants you to do is they want you to assess the risk, assess the exposure, and then implement the things that are required to eliminate or reduce that exposure, right? COVID's no different. But OSHA has created this exposure assessment, and they've identified very high risk as people working on people with COVID, so doctors, nurses, lab techs, morgue workers, actually working on people who have COVID. High risk as employees working around people with COVID, so doctors, nurses, paramedics, mortuary workers, but not actually working on the people with COVID. Medium risk, which is the vast majority of employers outside of the healthcare industry. And those are employers whose employees work in close proximity to others, so grocery, retail, restaurants, schools, manufacturing. And then low risk, minimal contact with others. And in that case, you got construction in some instances, truck drivers, landscapers, et cetera. Next slide. And as I discussed, again, they have issued specific guidance for virtually every type of employer. So after this call, if you still aren't sure as to what you're supposed to be doing, go to the CDC website, go to the OSHA website, and find that PDF that pertains to your industry and adopt that guidance. Next slide. All right, now we get into the nuts and bolts of what CDC and OSHA really want. And, I have compiled these next 3 slides after wading through page after page after page on the CDC website and the OSHA website. So, if you take nothing away from this, take away the next couple slides as to what you should be doing. I found it that CDC and OSHA didn't really, there's no organization as to their guidance. So I've tried to organize it by, who should be implementing the measure. So in this case, human resources, right? So for human resources, they want you to implement flexible sick leave and supportive policies, right? They want you to take steps specifically to protect employees who are at high risk for COVID. And they identify those as being high risk that are 65 and older, immunocompromised, and employees with health problems, diabetes, asthma, HIV, liver disease, kidney problems, obesity, et cetera. And they actually include a list on the CDC website. And those particular employees, you need to try and keep out of the workplace. The next thing is you need to communicate the policies to your employees, right? It's not just enough to draw them up, you need to communicate them. You need to limit the travel for work, and you need to limit the meetings amongst your employees. And I know, Rebecca, you had some comments on this slide.
Yes, because it's a really hard spot for HR to be in. And in helping them navigate this, I'll give you this example. Somebody called me and they were wanting to, send someone home. Why? Because they basically thought he was an old, fat smoker. And that's, maybe true, but you have to let people come to you. It's under the Americans with Disabilities Act. It regulates, all employers. We also have the Wisconsin Fair Employment Act. So you can't discriminate against people with disabilities. And so the thing is you have to balance that issue here. Is when you produce policies, make sure you're very careful about them, consult your favorite employment attorney, make sure, you can't issue things like everybody under age 65 can come back. It's not like these are bright line tests. You can run into somebody who's 70 years old and they're in far better shape and less risk than somebody that's 50 years old, right? We all know that. So you have to leave this as a case-by-case basis and not say, if you're diagnosed with this, you can't come back. That said, some of the normal things that we wouldn't be allowed to do under the ADA are now allowed. You can take everybody's temperature as they're coming in to work. You can require, if they're sick, that they give you more information, or that they, and we have different forms that, you can access about, certain questions to ask. Things, you don't just say, oh, we're sick, okay, come back. You have certain things you can make them show you to show it's okay that they come back after they're sick. You want to be a little bit more flexible with your attendance policies. You don't want to take a hard line with people. I had somebody ask me the other day, like, can we make people take their vacation time right now and say, take your vacation? I'm like, okay, but what about if they decide they want to travel somewhere and go to the beaches in Florida or do this and that? Like, are you prepared to deal with that? You have to think all the way through on some of these policies. And when you issue them, you can be clear that this is a temporary policy. So you're not rewriting your whole handbook, but just be very, very careful and don't play doctor. Okay, so it's a fine line between making sure people are safe and not diagnosing and deciding what's best for people either.
Okay, next slide.
I'm trying. Sometimes my computer is a little bit, okay, there we go.
All right. So this is the CDC and OSHA guidance that I've identified as being more operational, right? So they want you to conduct a COVID risk assessment and implement the necessary engineering and administrative controls, right? So they want you to go in based on, what you do based on your facility, and they want you to individually evaluate it and assess it and determine, these are our areas of concern. These are the things that we do. These are the locations within our facility where there's a high possibility of transmission. And then they want you to think through how you reduce that, right? So think about, your workplace and your workers and think about what the potential exposures are and then address those. Educate employees how to protect themselves, right? Again, this seems to be the step that many people miss. And it sounds stupid to say, hey, you should tell your employees why you're asking them to wear a mask, and why you're asking them to wash their hands, and why you're asking them to not touch their face. But, sometimes we need to treat employees like they're children, right? And we need to tell them, these are why you need to do these things. Conduct daily health checks, right? So screening questions. Before your employees come to work, every day, they should be asked, they should be considering, do they have any symptoms? Do they have a cough? Do they have a fever? And if they do, they shouldn't be coming to work. I have a lot of clients that are doing temperature checks, right? My construction, my manufacturing, the places where employees are congregating, in one general area, even if it's a huge facility. I mean, temperature checks, people are doing them, right? Some people are asking employees to check their own temperature. Some people are taking the employee's temperature with one of those external thermometers. And then I have some employees that are using thermal cameras, that are using walk-through thermometers. I mean, these are things that people are actually implementing to protect themselves and their employees. Require sick employees to stay home, right? There's a little badge of courage that comes along with coming to work when you're sick, right? And being that good employee. But in this case, we don't want employees to be doing that. If they're sick, if they got a cough, if they're sneezing, we want them to stay home. Make employees that show symptoms at work leave, right? I had a client, a construction client, and he said that they were out on a project. An employee got ghost white, and he went and sat in his car and ate lunch and came back to the site, and he threw up, right? And, they thought they were just going to let him power through the day. No. If you see somebody like this, if you see somebody coughing, sneezing, even if it didn't start till lunchtime, you got to send them home. Next slide.
And one thing too, Matt, is that I've had that situation come up. Now it's a vomit. That sounds lovely. But in my case, someone was just, coughing everywhere profusely. And this was, even back before we all had masks on. And she didn't want to go home. And it wasn't a choice. You send people home because you can't leave it up to that individual employee to jeopardize the workplace. And God forbid something comes up later and she ends up having it. So.
Yeah, and we did get a question, how do you deal with a sick employee that is not COVID related? Well, if they have COVID-like symptoms, they have to be sent home, right? I don't know how you make the determination that it's not COVID related unless they provide you with a doctor's note, in which case, if they provide you with a doctor's note that they're sick, they should probably stay home anyways.
My other take on that, Matt, is let's look at the position. Like, who is this person? One, is it something they can do from home? If they're, a high essential worker, is it something that they can't do from home? And then in that case, if they can't do it from home, you're telling me you have no one else and that specific person needs to be there to finish out their shift. And, you know, that's kind of the standard is why not err on the side of caution? Why play doctor?
Yeah, again, and that's really the theme for this is, you know, you just have to be so cautious about this, not just to prevent people from getting sick, but to prevent future claims. You know, and that's really what the CDC and OSHA is stressing. You know, there's an underlying theme under all of this, which is, hey, just be really cautious when you reopen, right? And it's the people who aren't cautious. It's the people that throw caution to the wind and say, I'm not wearing face masks. Everybody's coming in. I'm not following any of this. You're violating my rights. I mean, these are the people that are going to get crushed when all of this stuff, if COVID infections start popping up again. But when the tsunami of claims comes, I mean, these are the people that are going to get it.
A funny story real quick in that, it's Matt, but one line, I won't interrupt you again on this slide, I promise. But one funny story in that regard to bolster Matt's point even, you know, further is that, you know, I would get that a lot with employment policies and people wanting to set these like aggressive policies. And for a while back, before healthcare reform was passed, people were trying to get creative with, you know, health plans and what they were doing. And I would have, Walmart had come out with something, I don't remember what it was, but I got so many clients who were sending me the article about Walmart and, hey, can I do this? Can I do this? And my response was always like, well, do you have the legal department that Walmart has? Do you have the legal department that Disney World has? Do you have the resources they have? I mean, if you want to dedicate your resources to that and be cutting edge, then that's, you know, that's kind of the position you want to take when you're setting into and deciding on embarking on a fight.
Okay. And those are all good points, and I'll actually follow up on that once I get through this slide. So the CDC operational guidance continued, right? So policies for distancing, this is the big one, right? And this is the one that we see on the news every night and on social media where you have these employers that aren't requiring any distancing. So to the extent you can, CDC recommends staggering shifts, right? Reducing capacity, separating people, right? If you go to a restaurant, sitting them every other table. If they're in a classroom, sitting them every other desk. You know, I saw an article about New York's parks, and New York's parks had created these circles, had spray painted these circles on the ground 6 feet apart. And that's what people are doing. And that's kind of what, if you want to be in complete compliance with the CDC, those are the things you need to be thinking about. Implementing engineering controls, physical barriers, plexiglass. Anyone that's gone to McDonald's or a bank or anywhere else has seen these, right? And OSHA loves plexiglass and separators and dividers, and so does the CDC. And so, you know, if you can't separate people, putting up physical barriers is a great idea. You know, increased ventilation and ventilation systems. You know, I continue to see guidance coming out that being outside and being in areas with great ventilation are the best thing for this, right? Being at the beach, being at the park. And so I've seen, you know, I've seen some CDC guidance and things saying, you know, if to the extent you can open doors and windows and do those things, you should. Personal protective equipment, right? This is obviously a huge one in healthcare. You know, a lot of people think masks, the face masks, the surgical masks are personal protective equipment. For the most part, that's really not considered personal protective equipment unless you're talking about in the healthcare arena. But gloves, masks, face shields, you know, to the extent that any of that is practical for you or expected if you're in the healthcare industry, you should be adopting that. Implement administrative controls, right? Face masks, training, those types of things. And then conduct routine cleaning and sanitizing, right? So make wipes and cleaning supplies readily available. Have soap at all sinks, which, you know, you think would be common sense, but some people don't have those. The other thing is with the cleaning and sanitizing is if you get a COVID case, then you really have to sanitize the area, right? It's at that point, it's not just wiping it down with a rag with some soap on it. It's something more than that. Next slide, please. All right, and we kind of talked about this, right? If employee becomes sick during the day, send them home. Surfaces in the workplace need to be cleaned and disinfected. One of the things that has, again, I'm handling a number of OSHA COVID-related fatalities, and I've seen many county health departments getting involved, right? And how do they get involved? Well, the employee dies, they do an autopsy, they test them for COVID, they come back positive. The county health department finds out who the employer is, and then they reach out to the employer. And they say to the employer, hey, this employee of yours died, they had COVID, who were they working around, right? We want the names, we want the telephone numbers, we want to start this kind of contact tracing. And so I've had this happen in 5 separate cases in the last couple of weeks. So if you have someone, you know, that comes back as a positive COVID test, you should do that contact tracing yourself, right? Figure out who was around them, figure out who was exposed to them, have those people quarantined, right? I mean, unless it's a fatality, the county health department isn't going to get involved. And God forbid that that happens. But even if you have just a regular positive COVID case, that's what you should be doing. Next slide. All right. And then we start talking about, okay, let's say I have an employee that has COVID. When can they come back to work, right? The CDC has a whole page devoted to that. And I've drawn a red X next to what I think is the practical guidance here. And so, you know, if you have an employee who has COVID, you know, they can come back 3 days since they're fully recovered, meaning they have no symptoms, they have no fever. And so that's really what the suggestion is, right? If somebody gets COVID, wait until they're better, and then wait 3 more days, and then they can come back. Next slide, please. What about for employees that don't have COVID but are exposed to people with COVID, whether at home or in the workplace, by a customer, by a coworker, whatever? If an employee has been exposed to someone with COVID, then they're supposed to quarantine for 14 days, right? And I think the CDC and everyone else has basically identified that as being the incubation period for COVID is, you know, you can have it for 14 days without showing any symptoms. So if they're quarantined and then they start to show symptoms, then you wait until the symptoms are resolved and they've been better for 3 days, and then they can come back. If they're quarantined and they have no symptoms and they don't have COVID, they can come back after 14 days. Now, there are some exceptions for that rule. One of the big ones is for critical infrastructure workers who can return to work, but they have to wear face masks. This includes law enforcement, janitors, agriculture, manufacturing, IT, transportation, energy, and government facilities. There's also an exception for healthcare workers with a low-risk exposure, and obviously that accounts for PPE, because if all healthcare workers who are exposed to COVID, not accounting for PPE, had to be quarantined, we wouldn't have anybody working at the moment. Next slide. All right. This is kind of a miscellaneous one, but this has become a big issue for me and my clients. I've been getting a lot of questions about this, right? How is an employer expected to treat a COVID case by its employee? Are they required to record it? If the employee is hospitalized or, God forbid, dies, are they required to report it? So OSHA has indicated that it will require employers to record and report COVID cases when an employee has a confirmed case of COVID, so they have to have a confirmed case. The case is work-related, right? And the case involves one or more of the general recording or reporting criteria, which includes medical treatment beyond first aid, days away from work, hospitalization, death, et cetera. So in order for a COVID case to be work-related, the employee has to be infected at work, right? It's not enough that he or she contracts the disease outside of work and then displays symptoms at work. And you're saying to me, Matt, how do we know where the employee was infected? And that's a great question. And so OSHA followed up its initial guidance with more guidance saying that it's only recordable or reportable if the employer has been provided with objective evidence confirming that the case is work-related and the employee was infected at work, right? So what is the practical takeaway from that? I think if you have an employee who is convinced that they got infected at work and they come to you and they say, I got infected with this at work, and they provide you with objective evidence as to why they believe that they were infected at work, and you think that they're right, then at that point, I would say the criteria has been met and you either need to record or report it. But, you know, I have not had a case, and again, I'm working on 5 separate COVID-related OSHA fatalities right now. I have not had a case where the employer has been presented with objective evidence establishing that the employee was infected at work. So they really kind of put the burden on the employee to convince you that they were infected at work. Next slide. So what's really happening with OSHA right now? OSHA is overwhelmed with calls and complaints regarding COVID. Absolutely overwhelmed. I mean, they are getting so many calls and so many complaints. A lot of it just about, you know, just people walking around seeing people without face masks. They're calling OSHA, right? So you got the neighborhood busybody who doesn't like the kids on the park. You know, they call OSHA. So OSHA is getting just inundated with these calls. And I deal with a lot of OSHA offices. A lot of their voicemails basically say, you know, if you have a COVID complaint, there's nothing we can do about it at this point. And what makes it even more complicated is OSHA offices themselves are closed and they're all working from home, right? And I put that in parentheses, working from home for a reason. OSHA is generally not conducting inspections of employers and instead is allowing employers to self-report, right? So my clients, I've had some clients that have had amputations, that have had falls from heights, and even in those cases, you know, OSHA is just sending a self-report and saying, hey, tell us what happened, you know, fill out this investigative tool and send it back to us. So they're really not going out to sites and facilities at this time.
Can we just note for a second that other attendees as well as me are probably laughing because you're just like, amputations and falls and from heights, and it's kind of funny. So it's so casual.
Yeah, I mean, the sad reality, that's what I deal with every day. So, you know, it happens. Rebecca, can we go back one slide? So unless it's tied to a fatality, right? OSHA has come out for fatalities and they will continue to do so. I don't do a ton of work in the healthcare sector, but my understanding is that they are not going out to healthcare right now either. Now there's exceptions, but for the most part, OSHA's staying at home, right? The one thing OSHA is doing is even if they don't open an inspection, they don't ask you to self-report, what OSHA's been doing a lot when they receive a COVID-related complaint from an employee or a union or someone else, they just send the employer a letter. And they're sending the employer the letter and they're saying, hey, Mr. Employer, we received a complaint. We're not going to investigate it, but we want you to do whatever you need to do under the CDC and the OSHA guidance to make sure that you're protecting your employees. Next slide. So what do you do, right? What should you do when you get off of this webinar? Well, you should go through the OSHA and CDC guidance that pertains to your industry and your business, right? You should wade through it and you should adopt a COVID plan, a written plan, and you should train on it. In all of my ongoing OSHA COVID-related inspections, what OSHA is doing is they are sending us a long list of requests, basically requesting everything that we're doing relating to protecting our employees from COVID, right? And the easiest way to respond is to just say, OSHA, here's our COVID plan, right? And once you provide them with the plan, they know that you've done a risk assessment, right? They know that you've documented your findings. They've known that you've thought through what the hazards are, and you are identified and are implementing the steps outlined in the plan to protect your employees. So to me, adopting a COVID plan and training on it and implementing it is your get out of jail free card, not just for future COVID claims, but for potential OSHA inspection, potential inspections from the local health department, the local municipality, the bad press in the media. That's what needs to be done. So what should be in your plan? If you have an employee that has COVID, no work until their symptoms are resolved for 3 or more days, right? If an employee gets COVID at work, you send them home and you sanitize. The second component is you need to evaluate your workers for COVID. And if signs, you must make them leave, right? What does that look like? Take their temperature or inquire as to their temperature or a fever. Ask them each day questions about their exposure, right? Does anyone in your house have it? Do you have a cough? I saw they just added to the list lack of sense of smell and taste. So can you still smell and taste? I mean, you want to go through these questions. And then to the extent you can, you want to document the answers, right? So I have clients in the manufacturing and the construction industry that basically are making their employees sign off on something each day, indicating that they have no symptoms, indicating that they're not exposed to people with coronavirus. So if you have the ability to do that, do it. Obviously, if somebody gives you an answer that's not good, right? Yes, I have a fever. Yes, I have a cough. Yes, my mom has it. Those people need to go home. Next slide. All right. The next one, and I've kind of prepared this in the hierarchy that I think OSHA and the CDC wants to see it, right? Spread workers out. I mean, we are so inundated. I'm so tired of the phrase social distancing, but that's what people want, right? So spread workers out, stagger start times, designate which way traffic goes, right? If you've been to the grocery store, right, they have these arrows that say you can only go this way in the aisle, you can only go that way in the other aisle. So try and think about those things. Install barriers where people can't distance, right? So if you have employees that necessarily work within 2 feet of each other, think really hard about installing some sort of barrier between them, plexiglass, a shower curtain, something to protect them. If you're not able to distance and you're not able to install barriers, then you should give workers masks, right? Might not even be a bad idea to give them masks in addition to the barriers, right? In addition to spreading them out. The more the merrier. But again, you want to be practical with this. Make soap, sanitizer, and wipes readily available. Have bathrooms routinely cleaned and sanitized. Do not meet in large groups, right? Don't call the whole company there for your COVID training and pack them into seats, right? If you're going to have meetings, you got to spread people out. Eliminate communal water jugs, coffee stations, and break areas. Next slide. All right, what if you don't have a COVID plan, right? What if something goes wrong? Well, I have employers are being contacted about not having COVID plans and or not enforcing their plans by. I have had clients contacted by all of these people. OSHA, the health department, unions, municipalities, and even in one client's case, the state's attorney general's office contacted them, and I don't know why, but they did. But what happens if you get one of those letters? What happens if you get a letter from OSHA or from the health department or from the union or the municipality or the state's attorney general office saying, hey, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing relating to COVID? I mean, that's going to drastically increase your exposure and liability for COVID claims, right? I think once the dust settles on this, you're going to see smart plaintiffs' attorneys submitting Freedom of Information Act requests to OSHA, to anyone to find out who these letters have been sent to, right? And that's who they're going to go after, and they're going to try and find clients that they can pursue these people. Next slide. Okay, that's it.
That's us. That's our lovely glamour shots. I just want to mention one thing in that, you know, the goal of today was not to scare you and overwhelm you with the thought of opening. I think that I think Matt shared the sentiment that, you know, the goal is to educate and help you plan for this. Because I think we all, you know, there's different levels of anxiety and different levels of comfort, as Matt mentioned, but you need to get everybody comfortable with coming back, your customers, your employees, everyone, and the best way to cure anxiety is through preparation and planning. So I thank you for your time today. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I just want to, there is a question, and I do just want to echo Rebecca's sentiment is, you know, I mean, yeah, you know, I read everything about this, right? Doing what I do. And, you know, I see there's science both ways on masks, right? You can read in very reputed medical journals that that masks aren't really helping and that they're increasing people touching their face and they're increasing the likelihood of exposure. And so, you know, I question a lot of the guidance being provided, but which is fine personally, but when you're talking about, you know, a business, whether you question the guidance or not, you are much better off and much safer to be following that guidance, right? So it's one thing to have your opinions at home, and I have very strong opinions, but, you know, it's a different thing to be having opinions in the workplace, right? So don't let your personal opinions cloud.
Them. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And so we did have one question: is out-of-state travel automatically considered an exposure to COVID-19 and a requirement for quarantine from the workplace? Rebecca, do you know? My understanding is that it is not automatically considered an exposure to COVID-19, but that many employers are adopting the presumption that there has been an exposure with out-of-state travel.
You're exactly right. Like foreign travel obviously not allowed, but I think one of the issues is whether it's absolutely critical for business versus hey, we want to travel to this state because everything's open, which is what we see, you know, working with HR and employees. So that's why employers are saying, fine, if you want to go take vacation, but then you have to understand that when you come back, you have to agree that you'll do a 14-day quarantine at home. And that's at your cost. If you run out of time, that's unpaid. We're not doing this. This is your choice. Because the business doesn't want to take on, there's no reason for a business to take on that liability.
Yeah, and then just one more point that I meant to follow up on. Rebecca mentioned Disney earlier in this, and I just read an article yesterday about Disney moving forward is going to require its customers, not its employees, but its customers, to essentially waive liability and basically sign waivers relating to potential COVID exposure. So for those of you listening in who are concerned about or have customers or the public coming into your facility, that's something that employers are looking at and adopting now to limit their exposure for customer-related COVID claims.
Right. So again, thanks everyone for joining. As I mentioned before, the slides will be emailed to you after this program. If the recording is a decent quality, which I have not been on a webinar where it hasn't been, but you know, there's always a fluke. But you know, if it's good quality, they'll include that with the slides as well. And if you don't get it in a day or so, again, feel free to check your spam folder, or please check your spam folder, and that's our email and phone numbers if you have any questions and want to follow up with either of us. So again, thank you. Have a good day. Hopefully we'll be getting some sunshine soon up here in Manitowoc, and I will see you out at a safe distance.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.